Welcome to the dark past. Step into the shadows of history where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now. Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. The first time she arrived at the edge of the jungle, no one took much notice. A young girl, no older than 16, with dark skin glinting under the afternoon sun, stepped lightly over the cracked dirt path, leading from the river to the remote plantation. Her eyes were wide, alert, and quiet, as though she carried secrets that no one could guess. Her hands, though small, moved with a precision born of necessity, brushing aside leaves and adjusting the worn straps of her simple clothing. She did not speak much, not because she could not, but because she had learned early that words, when spoken without care, could be dangerous. The plantation master, a man of middling height, with a thick beard and a habit of barking orders, barely glanced at her as she was led forward. He had seen hundreds of girls like her, stolen from homes far away, brought to work under the unyielding heat of the southern sun. To him she was just another addition to his labor force, another pair of hands to bend to his will. But the moment his gaze flicked over her, something about her unsettled him. It was not boldness, it was the opposite. She did not flinch at his glance, did not lower her eyes. Instead, there was a steady, calm intelligence there, something that made him feel small, though he could not understand why. The overseer, a wiry man with restless eyes and a cruel shriek, stepped forward to lead her to the quarters where the other slaves were housed. He muttered instructions about her duties, fetching water, tending to the garden, assisting in the kitchen, but she heard none of them clearly. Her attention was elsewhere, drawn to the thicket of trees that bordered the plantation. The jungle began where the neatly cultivated fields ended, an unbroken wall of green that seemed alive, whispering in the wind. Most of the white men avoided it. They told stories about wild animals, poisonous plants, and strange noises that seemed to carry through the canopy at night. But the girl did not hesitate. She watched, studied, and memorized every edge, every shadow, every sound. The first days were the hardest. She worked silently, performing the menial tasks assigned to her, keeping her head low, moving quickly when no one was watching. But the jungle called to her. At night, when the overseer's lanterns dimmed, and the other slaves slept in their rows of wooden bunks, she would creep out to the edge of the clearing, crouching behind ferns, and watching the trees sway in the moonlight. She listened to the rhythm of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant roar of animals. Each sound was a puzzle, each movement a clue. She learned to distinguish the cry of a hawk from the whisper of a human, the snap of a twig from the shift of a predator. No one suspected her abilities at first. She appeared fragile, almost ordinary, carrying water buckets and tending the garden with quiet efficiency. Yet in her eyes there was a spark of understanding that made her different from everyone else. She did not fear the jungle because she did not see it as a threat. She saw it as home, a living, breathing entity that could be studied, understood, and respected. Her mind mapped every hidden path, every concealed hollow, every vine that could hold her weight, and she began to test herself against it, venturing further and further each night, learning how to move without being heard, how to use shadows as concealment, and how to anticipate the movements of the creatures that lived there. The first real test came when a small group of white men decided to assert their authority. They had noticed her wandering near the jungle's edge afterward, and took it as a challenge to their control. One of them, a brash young man with a cruel smirk, insisted he could follow her and teach her a lesson about obedience. He had no idea that she had been watching him just as closely as he had been watching her. She had learned every patrol route, every hidden gap, every time they let their guard down, and she waited, patient, knowing that the jungle itself would aid her. He followed her one evening, insisting that she lead him to her secret spots to prove she was not hiding anything. She walked slowly, deliberately, letting him think he was ahead, guiding him down paths that seemed easy and safe. But the further he went, the more disoriented he became. The sounds of the forest multiplied, the chatter of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures. Shadows shifted in ways that confused the eye. Vines seemed to twist differently than they had a moment before. Every step he took led him deeper into an environment he did not understand. Meanwhile, the girl moved with precision, observing him from just beyond his line of sight. She noted his breathing, his posture, the way he hesitated at unfamiliar sounds. She had learned from the jungle how to manipulate perception, how to use the natural chaos of the wild to her advantage. By the time he realized he was lost, night had fallen fully. The jungle was alive around him, filled with noises that seemed to grow closer, to circle, to threaten. And yet she was nowhere to be seen, invisible in the tangle of foliage, when he stumbled, terrified, trying to retrace his steps. The girl watched silently from above, crouched on a low branch of a tree. His panic was almost palpable, and she understood the lesson had begun. She did not need to strike. She did not need to raise her voice. The jungle itself, trained by her knowledge and presence, did the work. Twigs snapped under unseen weight. Shadows moved just out of reach, and the cries of nocturnal predators echoed in the distance. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, but the paths seemed to twist, returning him always to the same place, a clearing he could not identify. By the time he made his final desperate attempt to escape, she was gone entirely. No one ever saw him again. The plantation whispered about his disappearance, the story growing with each telling. Some said the girl had called the animals to her, that she could control the forest itself. Others whispered that the jungle was alive, and she was its chosen guide. Fear of her spread quickly. Yet no one dared speak openly, not for fear of questioning the strange, uncanny power she seemed to possess. Despite the growing legend, the girl remained calm, understated, and deliberate. She never flaunted her abilities. She did not laugh at those who had failed to follow her. Instead, she continued to move between the plantation and the jungle, gathering food, observing the land, and learning. Each day she became more attuned to the rhythms of the forest, more capable of moving unseen, more confident in the power of patience and strategy over brute force. Other slaves began to notice her growing presence, though few dared to approach too closely. They watched how the white men whispered about her in corners, how fear changed their posture and tone. Slowly she became a figure of quiet power among them, someone who had mastered the impossible, someone who had turned the tables on those who had always believed themselves untouchable. By the end of her first month near the jungle, the plantation had changed subtly. Men moved with caution, glances were sharper, and the air carried a tension that had not existed before. And yet she remained invisible when she chose to be, moving through the fields and forests with a grace that belied her age, her experience, and the extraordinary skill she had begun to master. No one knew her name at first. She was simply the girl of the jungle, the shadow who moved without sound, the spirit of the trees. And as the first part of her story closed, the reader understood that this was only the beginning, that the forest had chosen her, and that any who dared follow would enter a realm they could never escape from. The jungle had always spoken to her, though no one else could hear it. From the first day she stepped beyond the plantation's fences, she felt its heartbeat, the subtle rhythm of life pulsing through roots, vines, and leaves. It whispered to her in a language older than memory, guiding her steps, teaching her patience, showing her where to tread lightly and where to move boldly. Over the weeks that followed her first nights near its edge, she began to understand more than she had ever believed possible. She learned the difference between a predator and a scavenger, between the sound of a bird startled by the wind and the warning call of an approaching threat. Every creature in the jungle became part of her classroom, each moment a lesson in survival, perception, and strategy. By daylight, she still returned to the plantation, carrying water or tending to the garden, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The white men grew increasingly unsettled by her quiet composure, by the way she could seem invisible, yet somehow always appeared in exactly the right place. But they saw her as a simple girl, incapable of danger, incapable of mastery. Only the jungle knew differently. and it was slowly teaching her how to channel that knowledge into power. She began to move further into the forest during the hours when the overseers were occupied elsewhere. The dense trees formed walls so thick they blocked sunlight. But she did not stumble. Instead, she learned to read the faintest clues. Broken twigs, crushed leaves, the subtle pattern of shadows cast by branches swaying in the wind. The jungle became her teacher, her protector, her playground. She discovered small streams hidden beneath overgrown foliage, pockets of edible plants unknown to the plantation, and secret hollows where the ground softened beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves ideal for hiding. Every night she mapped the land in her mind, storing routes, shortcuts, and hidden traps that only she could navigate safely. It was during one of these ventures that she discovered the caves tucked into the side of a rocky incline that few dared approach. Their mouths were dark and forbidding, the entrances partially concealed by vines and ferns. Most white men avoided the area, whispering of snakes, bats, and spirits that haunted the hollows. She, however, felt no fear. The cave was a sanctuary, a place where she could rest, plan, and study without interruption. She explored its depths cautiously, noting every twist and turn, every pool of water, every nook that could serve as a hiding spot or a trap for those foolish enough to follow her. From the cave, she began to experiment with the animals themselves. She observed them closely, noting how they reacted to movement, sound, and scent. Birds, monkeys, and smaller mammals all had their patterns, and she learned to mimic or manipulate them when necessary. She could create diversions by rustling leaves in one area, leading an observer toward it while she slipped silently along a hidden path. She learned which creatures could be allies and which could be dangers, and she adapted accordingly. As her understanding grew, so did her confidence. She began to test the limits of the men who underestimated her. The first real experiment involved a white overseer who had been particularly cruel, constantly watching her, trying to find an excuse to punish her. She waited until he followed her one evening, thinking she would be caught in the act of wandering the jungle. Instead, she led him along a winding trail she had memorized, through vines and fallen trees, across shallow streams and dense underbrush. Every step she took was deliberate, each choice calculated to disorient and intimidate him. The overseer stumbled repeatedly, cursed under his breath, and tried to retrace his steps. But every path he took seemed to twist back upon itself. Every direction he thought was forward became a circle. Panic began to settle into his voice, a quivering that betrayed him to the forest itself. The animals, sensing the disturbance, added to the alarm. A sudden rustle here, the screech of a hawk there, the distant howl of a predator. He was trapped by the jungle, and she watched silently unseen. Knowing she did not need to do more, nature itself had become her ally. By the time he fled back toward the plantation, he was exhausted, terrified, and muttering incoherently about the girl in the jungle that seemed alive. Word of his experience spread quickly, though many dismissed it as exaggeration. Still, fear began to grow. The plantation men whispered among themselves, their glances toward the edge of the jungle filled with unease. Even the master noticed it, though he could not put into words why the girl seemed different, dangerous, even despite her youth and apparent fragility. In the following days, she explored further. She discovered hidden paths that led to clearings where the soil was soft and fertile, ideal for gathering herbs and roots. She learned which plants could heal minor wounds and which could poison unsuspecting animals. She began to create small traps, not lethal, but effective in confusing anyone who might try to follow her. She used tripwires made from vines, small pits covered with leaves, and subtle markers to mislead the eyes of pursuers. Each night she returned to the plantation, carrying what she needed, blending in seamlessly with the others. No one suspected the breadth of her knowledge, the precision of her movements, or the depth of her power. She also learned patience. The jungle had taught her that time wasn't a lie. Actions that seemed slow or deliberate often yielded far greater results than those taken in haste. She waited, observed, and prepared, understanding that her survival depended not on brute strength, but on cunning and foresight. She became a master of anticipation, able to predict the movements of both men and animals with astonishing accuracy. Her connection to the jungle deepened. She began to notice patterns in the wind, in the flow of water, and in the movement of shadows that others could not perceive. She could predict rainfall by the smell of the earth, detect predators before they approach, and identify signs of human intrusion long before anyone else would notice. The forest became an extension of herself, a living network that she could navigate with ease, unseen and untouchable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she encountered another intruder, a man sent to hunt her down, confident that he could capture or punish her for wandering. Her nights became a blend of exploration and preparation. She mapped the jungle more thoroughly, marking dangerous areas and safe routes, learning where predators roamed and where the water ran clean. She created subtle signals for herself, marks on trees, disturbances in the undergrowth that allowed her to navigate vast distances without fear of getting lost. Every day she became more attuned to the rhythms of the land, more capable of using them to her advantage. And as the moon rose high over the plantation, casting silver light through the thick canopy, she moved silently through the jungle once more. Every leaf, every branch, every creature responded to her presence. She was no longer merely a girl, sent to labor on a plantation. She was the guardian of her domain, a master of the jungle, a figure whose knowledge and skill ensured that no white man would ever follow her path and return. By the time she returned to the edge of the plantation, carrying food and water, she was already planning the next steps. The jungle had taught her patience, observation, and cunning. It had become her ally, her teacher, and her shield. And she knew with the certainty born of experience that anyone foolish enough to follow her would meet the same fate as those who had already vanished, lost to the forest and its secrets, never to return. The night settled over the plantation, quiet except for the occasional cry of a distant animal. The girl crouched briefly at the edge of the fields, watching the guards and the master's men move through their routines, unaware of her mastery. And as she slipped silently into the shadows, disappearing into the heart of the jungle once more, the legend of the girl began to grow. An unstoppable force of nature, a master of the land, and a mystery that would haunt those who dared to pursue her for years to come. The first man to truly vanish had been arrogant, dismissive, convinced that the jungle could not hold any secrets he could not unravel. He was the overseer's favorite, a young white man with a sharp tongue and a cruel streak, who had spent months terrorizing the slaves. Convinced that fear alone ensured obedience, when he decided to follow the girl into the jungle, he believed it would be simple, a demonstration of authority, a lesson in obedience. He could not have been more wrong. It began innocuously. She had emerged from the plantation fields at dusk, carrying a small bundle of herbs and roots she had gathered in the forest earlier that day. The man had spotted her immediately, eyes narrowing in recognition. He was confident she would not attempt anything out of line. After all, she was just a girl, but she had learned patience, and she had learned observation. She had learned the value of letting her prey believe they were in control. He followed her quietly, careful not to let her see him, confident in his ability to navigate the forest. He had grown up in these parts, had learned the basics of tracking and reading the land, but this girl moved differently. Her steps were calculated, measured, precise. She left no marks where others would, no scent for the wine to carry, no sound to betray her position. She moved with a rhythm that belonged not to humans, but to the land itself. Hours passed, and the man's confidence began to waver. He thought he had memorized her path, that he could anticipate where she would go. But each turn, each clearing seemed to shift beneath him. The jungle played tricks on the senses. Shadows lengthened and shortened in impossible ways. Sounds echoed and bounced between trees, confusing the mind. Birds called from directions that made no sense, and rustling leaves suggested movement where none existed. He began to sweat, cursing under his breath, but pressing on, unwilling to admit he was lost. The girl watched from a hidden perch high above in the crook of a tree that had grown in perfect concealment. She observed his every step, noting his breathing, his hesitation, the slight tremor of his hands. She had learned long ago that fear could be magnified without a word, without a strike. Nature itself would obey her intent if she understood it, and she did. She understood the forest as an extension of herself. Each creature, each shadow, each sound, part of a network she could control. As night fell, the man grew desperate. The forest seemed to close in around him. Paths he thought he had memorized looped back upon themselves. Streams that should have guided him led to dead ends. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of a branch felt amplified, threatening. He began to shout, demanding to know where she was, demanding that she answer him. His voice echoed unnaturally through the trees, drawing the attention of unseen creatures. The girl allowed him his moments of panic. Stepping silently between shadows, invisible and uncatchable, he stumbled into one of the traps she had prepared weeks before, a subtle pit covered with leaves and thin branches. It was shallow enough not to seriously injure him, but deep enough to disorient and delay. As he scrambled out, he became further entangled in the natural maze she had memorized, the twisted roots, the low-hanging branches, the narrow pathways that seemed to shift depending on the angle of approach. Every move he made brought him deeper into confusion, further into the forest embrace. Hours passed, and the man began to fear the supernatural. He spoke of spirits, of the forest itself coming alive, of a girl who was not entirely human. Rumors spread among the other plantation men, though few dared speak of them openly. But within the girl, none of this was magic. It was understanding. It was patience, observation, and respect for the environment that allowed her to manipulate it subtly, directing his movements without laying a hand upon him. At the same time, she returned to familiar territory. She moved through hidden hollows and overgrown pathways that only she knew, slipping past large predators and small creatures alike. Her senses were heightened, her mind alive with every detail, the smell of damp earth, the sound of insects shifting under leaves, the soft rustle of the wind through the canopy. She was alive in a way that others could not comprehend, a part of the jungle's intricate web, a master of its rhythm and its secrets. By midnight, the overseer had exhausted himself. His shouts had grown weak, his steps slow, his mind fogged with fear and disorientation. He did not understand the forest. He did not understand her. And in that final moment, he stumbled into a narrow canyon hidden beneath vines and moss. The girl watched from a nearby ridge as he disappeared from view. His cries faded into the night, swallowed by the sounds of the jungle, leaving nothing behind but whispers of his fear. When he failed to return the next day, the plantation erupted in unease. The other men searched, scouring the jungle with torches and dogs, but they could not find him. Every path seemed to shift when they approached. The forest refused to yield its secrets, and the girl had become the invisible hand guiding their failure. Tales began to circulate quietly among the slaves and the men alike, of a girl who could vanish into the jungle, of paths that led nowhere, of a forest that protected her as if it were alive. Fear spread, a powerful tension that clung to every corner of the plantation. Despite the growing legend, she continued her routine. She carried water, tended the garden, and spoke to no one more than necessary. But her mind was always active, always calculating. She learned from every encounter, every failed pursuit. She studied the reactions of the men, the patterns of their movements, and the ways in which the forest amplified their mistakes. Each failure of the white men reinforced her confidence, her understanding. In her legend, the slaves began to notice subtle changes. The once feared overseers moved more cautiously, hesitated where they once commanded, and spoke in hushed tones about the girl and the jungle that seemed to bend around her. She did not instruct or command, but her presence alone shifted the power dynamics. Fear, she understood, was a weapon as potent as any tool or blade. The plantation itself became a stage where her influence was quietly felt, even if none could articulate it fully. Night after night, she explored further. She discovered hidden springs, pockets of herbs with medicinal properties, and elevated perches that allowed her to survey large stretches of the forest. She became intimately familiar with the behavior of every creature, the way a hawk shifted with the wind, the path a snake followed beneath the leaves, the nightly routines of predators large and small. Each piece of knowledge became a tool, each observation a potential advantage. Her mastery extended to manipulation of the human element. She learned how to use sound and shadow, not just the forest's natural obstacles, to instill fear. Twigs snapped just so, leaves rustled in unnatural patterns, and animals responded to her subtle cues. The overseer had been her first lesson in this, a demonstration of what was possible when patience and intelligence combined with knowledge of the natural world. As weeks turned to months, the legend grew. Stories of her ability to vanish, to manipulate the forest, and to cause the disappearance of those foolish enough to follow her circulated throughout the plantation and neighboring farms. No white man dared venture into the jungle without fear, and even those who claimed courage began to hesitate, reconsider, and sometimes retreat altogether. The girl had become a force, invisible yet undeniable, her influence spreading beyond her immediate actions. One evening, a new man arrived, a wealthy landowner from a nearby state, confident in his abilities, eager to prove that the jungle held no secrets he could not conquer. He carried a lantern, a pistol, and a sense of superiority, convinced that his wealth and knowledge would protect him. But he was already walking into the trap the girl had anticipated. She had studied the habits of men like him, their overconfidence, their impatience, their reliance on brute force over observation, and she had prepared. As he entered the jungle, she allowed him to follow, observing silently from above, hidden in the canopy. Every decision he made, every step he took led him deeper into unfamiliar territory. Twigs broke beneath unseen weight. Leaves whispered in directions that made no sense, and shadows twisted unnaturally. Panic settled in quickly as the man realized that he could not navigate the land as he had assumed he would. By the time he vanished entirely, she was already miles away, moving silently through her hidden paths, untouched, unobserved, and free. The jungle had claimed him just as it had claimed the overseer before him. In the legend of the girl, the black slave who lived in the jungle grew stronger. Her presence, her skill, and her connection to the forest became the topic of whispered conversations, fearful glances, and hushed warnings. No one could challenge her, no one could follow her, and the jungle itself seemed to bend to her will. She returned to the plantation only when she chose, carrying provisions, herbs, and knowledge she had gained from her exploration. She moved among the fields and the men as if nothing had happened. Yet the awareness of her abilities lingered in every whispered word, every weary glance. The forest taught her patience, observation, cunning, and strategy. And now the lessons of the jungle extended beyond survival. They became legend. By the end of this part of her story, it was clear the girl was no ordinary slave, no ordinary child. She had become a master of the land, an orchestrator of fear, a presence so elusive and so capable that the plantation itself seemed transformed. The white men knew that anyone who dared follow her would disappear, and the slaves knew that she was a protector, a guide, and a force beyond comprehension. Her mastery of the jungle had begun to define her identity, and the tale of her first vanished pursuer would become a story told for generations, a warning and a testament to her extraordinary skill. By the time the sun rose on the 4th week of her independence in the jungle, the girl had become something more than human in the eyes of the plantation. Her presence was whispered about in every corner, a shadow among the trees, a phantom of the forest, a force that no white man could comprehend. But she did not concern herself with their fear. The jungle had taught her that power came not from confrontation, but from understanding, patience, and strategy. Every branch, every leaf, every creature was now an extension of her will. She had begun to explore deeper territories, places the plantation men had never dared to enter. The jungle thickened there, dense with vines and tangled undergrowth. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving the floor in a permanent twilight of shifting shadows. It was a dangerous place, home to predators large and small, hidden pits, venomous plants, and treacherous terrain. Yet she moved through it with ease, barefooted and silent, her senses attuned to every detail. The faint smell of moss, the soft vibration of water moving beneath roots, the subtle rustle of leaves that indicated movement far beyond human sight. The first time she tested a trap on purpose, it was almost accidental. A young plantation boy sent to retrieve water from a stream she often visited wandered too close. She watched from a distance as he stumbled into a camouflage pit she had crafted weeks earlier for practice. It was shallow, but enough to scare him and teach him caution. She had no intention of harming him. Her intent was to understand the effect of her creations, to learn how the land could protect her and warn others without the need for direct confrontation. The boy scrambled out, crying, shaken, and ran back toward the plantation. That night, the adults whispered among themselves, claiming the jungle had trapped him with its spirits, though no one dared investigate. Encouraged by this small success, she began to construct more sophisticated traps. Using vines, fallen branches, and natural debris, she devised snare systems, pitfalls, and misleading trails. Each design was subtle, almost invisible to anyone untrained in her knowledge. She experimented with camouflage, learning how sunlight, shadows, and movement could obscure the presence of a trap entirely. She tested each system rigorously, noting what worked and what did not, refining her techniques until she had created a network of defenses capable of confusing even the most determined pursuer. The forest itself became her assistant. Animals, both predator and prey, responded to her presence and her subtle guidance. Birds would fly overhead, distracting observers, while monkeys leapt through the canopy, drawing attention away from the path she used. Smaller mammals scurried across the ground in patterns that seemed accidental, but were carefully orchestrated. Even the wind shifting subtly through the trees carried sounds and scents that worked to her advantage, masking her movements and heightening the confusion of any who dared follow her. Her growing expertise did not go unnoticed. One evening she saw a group of white men approaching the forest edge. There were at least 6 of them armed with lanterns, whips, and crude weapons. Their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. They had come to challenge her, to prove once and for all that no girl, no matter how clever, could escape the reach of men. But she welcomed them, not with confrontation, but with strategy. She had studied the habits of men like them, their overconfidence, their impatience, their tendency to underestimate what they could not immediately understand. She watched them as they entered the jungle, carefully noting their formation, their pace, and the way they moved through the terrain. She allowed them to lead, believing themselves ahead, confident in their authority, but every step they took was guided, manipulated, and observed. She had already prepared multiple false paths, pitfalls, and natural obstacles along their likely route. The forest seemed to shift under their feet, shadows elongating, roots catching their steps, leaves whispering in directions that confused the ear. It did not take long for chaos to ensue. One man tripped over a hidden vine, falling into a shallow ditch and scraping himself badly. Another stumbled into a pit he had disguised with leaves, catching a branch in his chest as he fell. Panic began to spread, compounded by the eerie sounds of the jungle, the distant screech of predators, the rustle of unseen creatures, the strange calls of birds that seemed to echo unnaturally. Each man began to doubt his own senses, questioning what was real and what was illusion. From a high perch in the canopy, she observed silently. She had learned early that fear could be more powerful than violence, that confusion could be weaponized without ever raising a hand. The men moved with hesitation now, their formation broken, their confidence shattered. The forest itself seemed alive, conspiring with her against them. She allowed a few minutes of their struggle, then adjusted subtle cues, nudging a branch here, mimicking the sounds of animals there to direct them further into the labyrinth she had created. As the night deepened, the group became more disoriented. Paths they thought were clear looped back upon themselves. Streams they attempted to follow led to dead ends. The jungle's natural dangers became amplified. Uneven terrain, thorny vines, and unseen roots combined to exhaust their bodies and minds. Their lanterns flickered, casting shadows that distorted reality, heightening their fear. Every moment they spent in the forest reinforced the lesson she had already learned herself. Control perception, respect the land, and let the environment do the work. One by one, the men began to falter. The strongest, a burly man with a crow glare, tried to assert authority, yelling at the others, attempting to reorganize them. But the forest responded to him differently, throwing obstacles in his path at the exact moments he least expected. His own frustration became a liability, causing mistakes that worsened their situation. By the time they realized they were lost, the girl was already miles away, moving silently through hidden paths, observing the results of her preparations with satisfaction. Hours later, when the men staggered back to the edge of the plantation, if they returned at all, they were exhausted, frightened, and humiliated. They spoke of a girl who vanished into the forest, of traps that seemed impossible, of a jungle that guided itself against them. The master, hearing their accounts, could only shake his head uneasy. No men had ever returned from the jungle unscathed when she was involved, and that fact gnawed at him like a persistent shadow. But the girl did not gloat. She returned to her routines, fetching water, tending the garden, speaking little, moving quietly. Her mastery of the forest was not for show. It was for survival, for understanding, and for protection. She knew that overconfidence could be dangerous, that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. The forest had taught her to respect its rhythms, and through that respect, she had gained an unparalleled advantage over those who underestimated her. Other slaves began to notice the changes. The plantation no longer moved with the same certainty. Overseers hesitated. Patrols slowed and fear permeated every interaction. Some whispered about her in awe, wondering how a girl so young could command such influence without authority, without weapons, without violence. She had become a symbol, a living legend who embodied intelligence, courage, and the raw power of understanding nature. Night after night she explored further, mapping territories previously untouched by human presence. She discovered natural shelters, hidden springs, and pathways that connected distant clearings. She cataloged the behavior of animals, learning the timing of nocturnal hunters and the movements of prey. Each piece of knowledge became another layer of her control, another way to manipulate the environment to her advantage. Her traps evolved. Simple pitfalls became complex mazes of vines and branches. False trails misled even the most determined pursuers. She learned how to use sound and movement to create illusions, branches snapping at precise intervals, leaves rustling in patterns, animals subtly redirected to create distractions. Each innovation made the forest more formidable, more mysterious, more impossible to conquer. The plantation itself became a stage upon which her legend played out. White men moved cautiously, their confidence eroded by repeated failures. Stories of the girl's cunning spread, whispered warnings and fearful glances growing with every encounter. The slaves recognized her as a protector, someone whose presence allowed them to navigate the dangers of the plantation with greater confidence. She did not lead them, she did not instruct them. Her influence was felt in the subtle shifts of behavior, the cautious respect, the silent acknowledgement of her skill. By the end of this part of her story, it was clear she was no longer simply a girl who wandered the jungle. She had become a master of perception and strategy, a figure whose presence reshaped the behavior of those around her. The forest was not merely a backdrop, it was her ally, her teacher, and her weapon. Any who dared enter it, whether out of curiosity, arrogance, or malice, would find themselves ensnared in the web she had woven. Guided by the rhythms of the jungle and the intelligence of the girl who had learned to move with it rather than against it, the legend of the girl who lived in the jungle continued to grow, whispered through the fields, the quarters, and the nearby plantations. Fear, respect, and awe became intertwined in every story told about her. And she remained quiet, deliberate, patient, her mind always alert, her body always ready, a living embodiment of the jungle's power and mystery. The forest had claimed her, and in turn, she had claimed it. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no turning back. By the time the 5th week of her life in the jungle arrived, the girl had become something beyond human. Her connection to the forest was no longer just survival, it had become mastery. She knew the terrain intimately, every hidden path, every treacherous route, every pocket of fertile soil and fresh water. She could anticipate the movements of animals and humans alike, predicting behavior with uncanny accuracy. The plantation men spoke of her in hushed tones, half in awe and half in terror, while the slaves began to regard her as more than just a fellow captive. They saw her as a protector, a force of nature who had turned the world around them into her own domain. It was a morning thick with mist when she first sensed the new arrival, a group of armed men, more experienced and more determined than any who had come before. Their presence was calculated, methodical. She could tell that these men were not acting on impulse. They had been sent specifically to capture her, to prove that the stories were exaggerated. Yet, as they stepped into the edge of the forest, she felt no fear, only anticipation. The jungle had taught her patience, and she had learned that the right moment, the perfect timing, could turn even the boldest hunter into prey. She observed them silently, hidden among the dense foliage of the trees, their boots pressed against the damp earth, lanterns swinging and casting shadows that flickered and danced across the undergrowth. Their weapons glinted, but she knew they would never reach her. They were entering her domain on her terms. Each step they took was recorded, each sound analyzed, each misstep catalogued. She allowed them to move forward, confident that the traps and diversions she had set would unfold precisely as intended. The first encounter was subtle, a slight disturbance in the underbrush, just enough to make a shadow move at the edge of their vision, sent one man spinning around, his hand tightening on his whip. A branch snapped, apparently of its own accord, and the sound echoed unnaturally, disorienting the group. One man fell into a hidden pit, and another, in an attempt to rescue him, became entangled in a network of vines she had positioned like threads in a spider's web. Panic began to spread among them, and the girl smiled silently from above, knowing that the forest itself was doing her bidding. She moved like a phantom, slipping between the branches and shadows, invisible, yet fully aware of every movement below. Her training with the natural world had honed her senses to an extraordinary level. She could hear the slightest change in wind patterns, the subtlest crack of a twig, the almost imperceptible vibration of footsteps. She could detect fear, desperation, and misjudgment in their behavior before they even realized it themselves. And she knew that these emotions would become as much of a weapon as the traps and obstacles she had created. As the men pressed deeper, they began to realize that the forest was not just a backdrop, but an active participant in their misfortune. Every path seemed to twist unexpectedly, every landmark led to nowhere. Every sound seemed to come from a different direction. Their confidence eroded quickly, replaced by confusion and fear. The girl guided them subtly, using the forest to her advantage. She rustled leaves at precise moments, dropped small objects from branches, and manipulated the shadows to create illusions of movement that were not real. The men were no longer hunters, they had become the hunted. Hours passed, and the group began to fracture under the weight of their own panic. One man argued loudly, trying to assert control, but his words were swallowed by the dense forest. Another tried to follow a stream they assumed would lead them out, only to find themselves trapped in a dense thicket, branches whipping against their skin, mud sucking at their boots. Every attempt to regain control only deepened their disorientation. By nightfall, the girl had led them on a labyrinthine path, exhausting them physically and mentally without ever confronting them directly. She had learned from previous encounters that fear could be amplified through patience and timing. She allowed moments of hope to emerge, paths that seemed clear and easy only to twist back into confusion. She used the natural sounds of the jungle, the distant growl of predators, the sudden flutter of wings, the rustling of leaves to create a sense of omnipresence, as though the forest itself were alive with intent. Her enemies began to believe that they were being watched constantly, that the girl was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. By midnight, the men were barely coherent. Their lanterns flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. They called out, demanding to know where she was, accusing each other of cowardice, blaming the forest for their failures. But the girl remained silent, unseen, calculating her next move. She understood the power of psychological warfare, the terror that came from uncertainty, the hopelessness of being pursued by someone who seemed invincible. Her strategy was not cruelty for its own sake. She had no desire to inflict harm beyond what was necessary to protect herself. Each trap, each diversion, each manipulation was designed to ensure her survival, to maintain the advantage she had cultivated through knowledge and patience. Yet she could not ignore the lesson it taught the oppressors. The jungle belonged to her, not to them, and their assumptions of dominance were meaningless within her domain. The following days were a study in observation. She learned the patterns of her enemies, how they reacted under pressure, how quickly they lost cohesion, how easily they were misled by sound and shadow. She began to develop new techniques, combining her natural camouflage with psychological manipulation. She left subtle signs for herself. A bent leaf here, a scratch on a tree there, guiding her through the forest while misleading anyone who tried to follow. Each innovation made the jungle even more formidable, more mysterious, and more impossible to conquer. Even the animals seemed to recognize her as a force of authority. Birds would scatter at her approach, then return to distract or mislead intruders. Monkeys would make sudden noises, drawing attention away from her hidden position. Predators, though dangerous, often hesitated, sensing an unusual presence in the forest. She had become part of the ecosystem in a way that transcended fear or understanding. The jungle responded to her intent as naturally as it responded to the rhythm of the sun or the flow of water. Her legend grew beyond the plantation. Nearby settlements whispered of a girl who could vanish into the forest, who could appear and disappear at will, who controlled the land itself. White men avoided the jungle when her name was spoken, fearful of the unknown, uncertain of what awaited them. Some claimed supernatural powers, while others attributed her skill to witchcraft. But the truth was simpler and infinitely more impressive. She had mastered the environment, learned its secrets, and used her intelligence, patience, and observation to become untouchable. Inside the plantation, her influence was subtle but profound. The slaves looked to her not as a leader, but as a symbol of hope and resilience. Her actions demonstrated that knowledge, courage, and strategy could outweigh brute force. That even the most oppressive systems could be challenged through skill and understanding. She inspired them to observe, to learn, to respect the world around them. Her presence transformed the psychological landscape of the plantation, shifting fear and power in ways the masters could not control. As the 5th week drew to a close, she prepared for a final test of her abilities. The men had regrouped, determined to prove that they could outsmart her. They moved with renewed confidence, carrying torches, weapons, and arrogance. But she had anticipated this. Every step they took, every strategy they employed had been considered in advance. She set new diversions, refined old traps, and positioned herself in the high canopy where she could observe every move without being seen. The confrontation, when it came, was a masterpiece of strategy. She manipulated sound and movement, guiding the men deeper into the jungle into traps that confused and exhausted them. Shadows twisted, branches blocked paths, animals created diversions, and the forest seemed to shift in impossible ways. Every mistake they made was amplified, every misstep deliberate in the grand design she had orchestrated. By the time they admitted defeat, the group was broken, demoralized, and terrified. They returned to the edge of the plantation, some limping, some shaken, none daring to speak of what had occurred except in whispers. The master, witnessing their return, could only sense a shift in power and control. The girl had become untouchable, a force whose mastery extended beyond survival into legend. She did not gloat. She continued her routines, fetching water, tending the garden, observing the world around her with quiet focus. Her connection to the jungle was total, complete, and unbroken. The forest had claimed her, and she had claimed it. Her skills, intelligence, and patience had transformed the environment into an extension of herself, a living ally that ensured her safety and amplified her influence. The story of her victory spread far and wide. reaching neighboring plantations, inspiring awe, fear, and speculation. Men spoke of her in hushed tones. Women whispered her name in reverence, and the slaves recognized in her a power that was both extraordinary and profoundly human. She had become a master not through brute force, but through understanding, observation, and patience, the very qualities that had allowed her to survive, thrive, and turn the jungle into her own domain. By the end of this part of her story, the lesson was clear. Mastery over fear, over environment, and over perception could elevate even the powerless to legendary status. The girl had transformed herself from a mere slave into a force of nature, a living embodiment of strategy, patience, and intelligence. The jungle was no longer simply a refuge. It was her kingdom, and she ruled it with a quiet, unyielding power that no man could challenge. By the 6th week of her life in the jungle, the girl had fully transformed the forest into an extension of herself. Every tree, every vine, every shadow was a tool, a weapon, a guide. She no longer simply survived. She orchestrated, manipulated, and commanded the environment with a precision that bordered on genius. Her reputation had grown beyond the plantation. Stories traveled along whispered paths, reaching other estates, nearby settlements, and even the rare traveler who dared venture near the jungle. The girl's legend had become a cautionary tale, a psychological weapon in itself. It began with the subtle changes in the plantation men's behavior. Those who had ventured into the forest before now refused to go near it. They spoke of phantom footsteps, impossible sounds, and sudden disappearances. Every minor incident, a broken branch, a rustling in the distance, a fleeting shadow, was attributed to her. Their confidence eroded daily, replaced by fear and suspicion. Even the master, who had once dismissed her as a simple child, now paused before sending anyone into the forest. The balance of power had shifted, and the girl understood it. She had learned that fear could be wielded as effectively as any weapon. She spent her mornings scouting deeper regions of the jungle, mapping hidden streams, natural shelters, and elevated perches from which she could observe miles of territory. She cataloged animal behavior meticulously, noting which predators hunted at night, which birds calls signaled danger, and how small mammals moved through the underbrush. Each observation became part of her mental map, allowing her to predict the movements of anyone who entered her domain. The forest was alive to her now, responding to her presence, amplifying her influence, and providing constant protection. One morning, she detected the approach of a larger group than ever before. 8 men armed with rifles, lanterns, and an air of arrogance born of disbelief in the stories. They had come not as individuals, but as a coordinated hunting party intent on proving that the girl's legend was exaggerated. They believed that numbers, firepower, and planning could overcome anything, even her cunning, but she knew differently. She had studied groups like them, anticipating the way overconfidence, ego, and lack of environmental understanding would betray them. She waited, observing their formation from the upper branches of a giant oak. The men moved in tight lines, confident and coordinated at first. Their lanterns cast long beams across the forest floor, illuminating paths she had already manipulated to confuse and trap them. They spoke loudly, attempting to assert authority over each other and the forest, but the jungle responded in ways they did not understand. A branch snapped in a location that suggested someone was following them, only it was empty. A sudden rustle of leaves in a distant direction made them turn, splitting their attention and coordination. Their initial confidence wavered just as she had anticipated. As the group advanced, she began to deploy her carefully constructed network of traps and illusions. Pitfalls disguised beneath leaves, tangles of vines arranged to trip and entangle, and misleading trails that looped back on themselves all came into play. Each man reacted differently to the obstacles. One panicked and shouted, another attempted to take the lead aggressively, and another froze entirely, uncertain where to move next. She observed every reaction, noting how fear distorted their reasoning and impaired coordination. The forest itself became a force multiplier, transforming their strength and weaponry into liabilities. By midday, The group was thoroughly exhausted and disoriented. They could no longer follow the natural signs they had relied upon, the flow of streams, the position of the sun, even the calls of birds, all of which she had learned to manipulate. Her control over the environment extended to subtle auditory illusions like rustling leaves, time to mislead branches, breaking strategically too. Startle and small animals moving to draw attention away from her hidden paths. Every element of the jungle worked in harmony with her, and she used it without ever revealing herself. The psychological impact was profound. The men began to distrust one another, accusing each other of mistakes and weakness. Their confidence eroded further, replaced by a growing sense of paranoia. Shadows became threats. Every sound a potential ambush. Every movement of the wind a signal of unseen presence. By the time they realized that they could not navigate the terrain, it was too late. Exhaustion, fear, and confusion had taken hold, leaving them incapable of coordinating or escaping effectively. She had anticipated the possibility of violence and had prepared subtle defenses. Hidden branches, carefully arranged vines, and elevated perches allowed her to maintain a safe distance while controlling the flow of the encounter. She understood that direct confrontation was unnecessary. The forest itself would do the work of her strategic intent. By letting the men make mistakes, exhaust themselves, and succumb to fear, she maintained complete control without ever putting herself at risk. Hours turned into night, and the group's condition worsened. Their lanterns flickered, and panic spread. One man attempted to charge forward aggressively, only to become entangled in vines designed specifically to immobilize him. Another fell into a camouflage pit, scraping his leg and further weakening his resolve. The jungle, guided by her presence, seemed alive with intention, and the men felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against them. The girl remained silent, observing, calculating, and allowing fear to work its magic. By midnight, the group had fragmented entirely. Some attempted to flee in different directions, each one becoming lost in the network of paths and traps she had created. Others stood frozen, paralyzed by exhaustion and terror. The girl moved silently between trees, checking her traps and adjusting minor elements to ensure maximum effectiveness. Every decision was deliberate, informed by observation and experience. She had turned the jungle into an instrument of strategy, intelligence, and control, and her enemies were powerless against it. The psychological impact on the plantation was immediate. Word of the failed attempt spread quickly, creating a climate of fear that affected not just those who had entered the jungle, but everyone who knew the girl's name. White men began to hesitate before venturing near the forest, and even routine tasks became colored by apprehension. Slaves, meanwhile, began to recognize the power of intelligence, observation, and patience over brute force. They learned from her example that survival was not simply a matter of endurance, but of understanding the environment and using it to one's advantage. The girl's influence extended beyond simple survival. She began to experiment with the jungle itself as a teaching tool, setting minor traps and challenges for herself and observing the behavior of the animals and humans alike. She learned how to use scent, shadow, and sound to create illusions, mislead observers, and anticipate the actions of anyone entering her territory. Every detail of the forest became a part of her strategy, and she moved through it with the confidence of someone who understood both the environment and the human mind. By the seventh day of the sixth week, she had refined her techniques to near perfection. Her traps were subtle but effective, her manipulation of sound and shadow flawless, and her understanding of human psychology complete. She could anticipate movements, predict reactions, and exploit fear without ever revealing herself. Her enemies were no longer threats. They were pieces on a chessboard, moved not by violence, but by knowledge, patience, and strategy. The legend of the girl continued to grow. Stories spread not just of her ability to vanish into the jungle, but of her intelligence, cunning, and mastery of strategy. Some claimed she had supernatural powers, while others whispered that the forest itself was her ally. But the truth was simpler and more extraordinary. She had become one with the jungle, a master of observation, intelligence, and survival. The forest responded to her intent, amplified her influence, and ensured that no one could challenge her effectively. By the end of the 6th week, it was clear that she had transcended the role of a simple fugitive or escaped slave. She had become a force of nature, a living embodiment of intelligence, strategy, and patience. The jungle was her domain, and she ruled it with a subtle, unyielding power that no man could oppose. Fear had become her weapon, observation her shield, and the forest her ally. She was untouchable, invincible, and legendary, a symbol of resilience and mastery in a world that had sought to control and diminish her. By the 7th week, the girl's reputation had reached a point where fear itself became a tool. The plantation men no longer approached the forest carelessly. They spoke in hushed tones, hesitated at every rustle, and questioned their own senses before stepping onto familiar paths. The girl had learned that mastery over the mind could be as powerful, if not more, than mastery over the physical environment. She had observed countless humans over the weeks, noting patterns of behavior, tendencies, and fear, and the ease with which uncertainty could unravel even the strongest-willed men. Her days began early with a quiet assessment of the forest. She moved barefoot through damp soil, listening to the subtle sounds of life awakening around her. Birds chirped their morning songs, insects began their soft hums, and the distant roar of a river provided a rhythmic heartbeat to the jungle. But the girl was aware of the duality of her surroundings. The beauty of the natural world was intertwined with its danger. She had learned to respect every creature, from the smallest ant to the prowling jaguar, understanding that each had its place and could either aid or hinder her. This week she decided to test her psychological tactics on a larger scale. A group of 10 plantation men, the most experienced and hardened among them, had volunteered to enter the jungle. They believed that numbers, strength, and coordinated planning would finally allow them to capture or kill her. They did not realize that they were stepping into an environment already mastered by someone who understood its secrets intimately. The girl observed them from above, hidden in the canopy, noting the rhythm of their movement, the way they divided their attention, and the subtle indications of arrogance in their posture. She allowed them to advance into the first layer of her defenses, a series of misleading trails designed to fragment and confuse the group. Each path appeared to lead forward, but in reality they looped back toward the same clearing, creating a sense of déjà vu and uncertainty. The men argued quietly at first, then more aggressively, their confidence eroding as they failed to find familiar landmarks. She observed from her perch, noting how quickly small frustrations escalated into mistakes. Next came the traps, each carefully designed to exploit both their physical and psychological vulnerabilities. A snare here, a pitfall there, subtle disruptions that created the illusion of a malevolent intelligence at work in the forest. One man fell into a shallow trap only to be caught by a net of vines dangling from a low branch. Another was startled by a series of strategically placed sounds which she had engineered using small stones, twigs, and even the movement of animals. Panic began to spread rapidly. The first indications of fear were enough to fracture their coordination entirely. The girl did not reveal herself. She had learned that her absence could be as frightening as her presence. Every rustle, every shadow, every whispering sound of the jungle worked to reinforce the idea that she was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The men began to move with hesitation, second-guessing their decisions and increasingly reliant on each other for guidance. Yet each man's anxiety amplified the other's, creating a feedback loop of fear. Their confidence, once a fortress, became a prison. By midday, the group was physically and mentally exhausted. They had traversed miles of jungle, followed false paths, avoided traps, and yet felt as if the forest itself was conspiring against them. One man attempted to take charge aggressively, barking orders, but his words only served to heighten tension. Miscommunication, missteps, and fear compounded each other until the group had fragmented into smaller, disoriented clusters. Each man was now vulnerable, isolated by the jungle and by his own faltering resolve. The girl used this moment to escalate her strategy. She deployed a series of auditory illusions. The sound of leaves snapping to mimic movement, the distant growl of a predator, the sudden flapping of wings in the canopy. Each sound was calibrated to exploit the fear she had observed, and each reaction confirmed her understanding of human psychology. The men's senses, once relied upon for survival, had become their greatest weakness. They could no longer trust their eyes, their ears, or even their own judgment. She allowed one man to become truly isolated, leading him along a trail that seemed promising, but ultimately led to a cleverly disguised pitfall. He fell, scrambling desperately, caught by a network of vines that held him in place just long enough to break his confidence entirely. By the time the others realized what had happened, he was already struggling in the trap, and their attempts to assist him only caused further confusion. Fear spread contagiously, infecting each remaining member of the group, weakening their will and clarity of thought. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shadows, the girl observed the remaining men from a high perch. They were scattered, exhausted, and terrified. Lanterns flickered weakly in the underbrush, casting distorted, dancing shadows that made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe, reality from illusion. She had turned the jungle into a living maze, a psychological labyrinth in which even the most capable hunters were disoriented, fearful, and powerless. Night in the jungle was her greatest ally. She used darkness as a weapon, moving silently above and around her pursuers. Sounds became her tools. The rustling of a small animal here, the deliberate snapping of a branch there, the distant hoot of an owl carefully timed to startle. Each auditory cue was designed to mislead, confuse, and terrorize. She manipulated the environment, not through confrontation, but through understanding and anticipation. By the time the group realized that they could not navigate the terrain, exhaustion and fear had already done the work of incapacitation. By midnight, the men were broken, their coordination was gone, their morale shattered, and their sense of reality distorted. Some attempted to flee in different directions, only to become lost in the maze of the forest. Others froze, paralyzed by uncertainty and the sensation of being constantly observed. The girl remained silent, her presence known only through the effects she had engineered. The forest had become her instrument, amplifying her intelligence and strategic skill while protecting her from direct danger. In the days that followed, her legend continued to grow. Stories of her mastery and cunning reached the plantation, where white men spoke of her with fear and respect. Her name became synonymous with the forest itself. To enter the jungle was to enter her domain, and few dared to do so. Even the master, who had once dismissed her as a child, recognized that she could not be controlled by conventional means. She had transcended the expected limitations of a slave, using her intellect, strategy, and understanding of both human psychology and the natural world to carve out a space of absolute authority. The slaves, meanwhile, observed her actions with awe. She demonstrated that survival and power were not determined solely by physical strength, but by intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand one's environment. Her victories against the plantation men inspired hope and admiration, showing that even in the harshest conditions, skill and cunning could prevail. She became a living symbol of resistance, a testament to the human capacity to adapt, learn, and thrive against overwhelming odds. Her routines during this period were deliberate and disciplined. She spent hours observing animal behavior, testing new traps, and refining her methods of deception and camouflage. She explored parts of the forest previously unknown, discovering hidden springs, natural shelters, and vantage points that allowed her to oversee vast stretches of territory. Her understanding of the jungle had become comprehensive, bordering on omniscient within her domain. Every plant, animal, and terrain feature was now a tool she could utilize to ensure her survival and control. By the end of the 7th week, she had effectively rendered the plantation men incapable of challenging her. Their attempts to capture or kill her had failed repeatedly, leaving them fearful and uncertain. The forest, once merely a refuge, had become a fortress, a living, breathing ally that amplified her strengths and neutralized their advantages. She had become a master strategist, a psychological tactician, and a symbol of fear and respect. The girl understood the power she wielded. Her mastery of the environment, combined with her ability to manipulate perception, had created an almost mythic figure in the minds of those who sought to control her. She was untouchable, not because of brute force, but because of intellect, strategy, and the deep understanding of both human nature and the natural world. The legend of the girl who lived in the jungle and controlled all who entered it was now firmly established, her influence extending far beyond her immediate surroundings. Her presence in the jungle had transformed the balance of power. She was no longer merely a fugitive. She was a force that could not be opposed, a living testament to the power of intelligence and observation. Fear had become her weapon, the forest her ally, and her enemy's own mistakes their undoing. She had transcended the ordinary, becoming a figure of legend, whose mastery of the jungle and human psychology ensured that no white man would ever underestimate her again. By the 7th week's conclusion, the girl had achieved a level of dominance over her environment and adversaries that few could comprehend. The forest had become an extension of her will, a living instrument through which she exercised control, protected herself, and reshaped the perception of those around her. She had turned fear into a tool, observation into strategy, and patience into power. Her legend was now complete in the minds of the plantation men. A girl who lived in the jungle, untouchable, omnipresent, and forever beyond their control. By the 8th week, the girl had become a living legend. Her mastery of the jungle was total, her command over the environment absolute, and her reputation had reached a level where even the bravest men hesitated to approach the forest. The whispers had grown into a collective fear that transcended logic. Stories of her exploits, of men lost, of traps unseen, of the forest itself seeming alive, were shared in towns and plantations alike. Each retelling only added to her aura, making her an almost mythical figure in the eyes of those who had never seen her. She had transformed from a frightened slave girl into a force that symbolized resistance, cunning, and survival against impossible odds. The forest had become an extension of her being. Every tree, vine, and shadow was part of a sophisticated system she understood completely. She had mapped out hidden water sources, secret pathways, and natural perches, giving her an advantage that was near impossible to counter. Birds, monkeys, and even predators seemed to recognize her authority. They moved in ways that complemented her strategy, acting as unwitting agents in her psychological warfare. Her perception of the forest had become so refined that she could sense intruders before they entered her domain, anticipate their every step, and manipulate the terrain to guide them into confusion and despair. This final week would test the limits of her abilities. Word had reached her of an organized hunt, a group of 12 men armed with rifles, torches, and the arrogance of experience determined to capture her once and for all. They believed that sheer numbers and coordination could overcome any obstacle, but they underestimated the girl's skill, her patience, and her deep understanding of both human psychology and the jungle itself. She observed them from her perch in the canopy, noting the way they moved, their subtle signs of overconfidence, and the predictability of their arrogance. She allowed them to advance into the outer perimeter of her territory. The first traps were designed not to harm, but to disorient misleading trails, disturbed foliage, subtle auditory illusions. Branches snapped unexpectedly, leaves rustled in directions that suggested movement, and distant animal calls were manipulated to mimic human presence. The men reacted predictably, their confidence faltering as they realized the forest was working against them. Every sound, every shadow, every step became a tool in her carefully orchestrated strategy. Hours passed, and the men grew increasingly frustrated. Their coordination began to unravel as each man became preoccupied with fear and uncertainty. The girl's knowledge of human behavior allowed her to predict mistakes before they occurred, and she used this understanding to her advantage. One man attempting to assert control became ensnared in a cleverly concealed pitfall. Another fell into a network of vines, his panic amplifying the tension for the others. By allowing these events to unfold naturally, She conserved her energy while maximizing their disorientation. By midday, the group was scattered and disoriented. They no longer moved as a unit. Their arrogance had dissolved into fear. The jungle, guided by her presence, seemed alive with intention. She manipulated every element, sound, shadow, and movement to reinforce the men's belief that the forest was sentient and hostile. She allowed brief glimpses of herself to be seen, a shadow flitting between branches, a flash of movement on the edge of vision, but never close enough to be confronted. These fleeting appearances amplified the psychological impact, making her seem omnipresent and invincible. As the sun set, she escalated her tactics. Darkness became her ally, allowing her to move silently above and around her enemies. The men relying on torches that flickered weakly became increasingly desperate. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant growl of a predator, the flapping of wings, was calculated to induce panic. The group's coordination disintegrated entirely. Men ran in different directions, tripping over hidden obstacles, shouting at one another in frustration, and losing themselves in the labyrinthine paths of the jungle. The girl's psychological warfare reached its peak when she allowed the men to believe they were being watched constantly. Subtle cues, a branch bending slightly, a shadow appearing briefly, a bird flying overhead, reinforced the notion that she was everywhere. The men's fear became self-perpetuating. Their imaginations, guided by her manipulations, filled in gaps with terror. One by one, they succumbed to exhaustion and despair. Unable to navigate the forest, and paralyzed by the sensation of being hunted by an invisible predator, she did not need to confront them directly. The forest itself did the work of her strategy. Traps immobilized the men. Misleading paths led them in circles, and fear undermined their judgment. By the time the group realized the extent of their predicament, it was too late. They were thoroughly defeated, their morale destroyed, and their bodies exhausted. The girl had proven once again that intellect, patience, and mastery of the environment were more powerful than brute force or numbers. The next morning, the remaining men fled, humiliated and terrified, back to the plantations they had come from. Word of their failure spread quickly, further amplifying her legend. No man dared venture into the jungle without acknowledging the girl's supremacy. Even those who had previously been skeptical recognized that she had become untouchable. The forest under her command was a living entity, and she was its master. Within the plantation, her influence was equally profound. The slaves observed her victories with awe, recognizing the power of intelligence and strategy over oppression. Her actions demonstrated that survival was not merely about physical strength, but about understanding the environment, observing patterns, and anticipating reactions. She became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring others to recognize their own potential and the possibility of resisting even the harshest circumstances. Her routines continued with unwavering discipline. She explored deeper regions of the jungle, refined her network of paths and traps, and studied the behavior of animals and humans alike. She discovered hidden water sources, natural shelters, and elevated vantage points that provided unparalleled visibility. Every plant, tree, and creature became a tool, a component of a sophisticated system that ensured her dominance. She was no longer merely surviving. She was orchestrating, planning, and shaping her environment with deliberate intent. As the 8th week drew to a close, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The girl, who had once been a frightened slave, had transformed into a master of her world. She had learned to harness fear, observation, and strategy, turning the jungle into a fortress that no man could penetrate. Her enemies had become instruments of her legend, their failures amplifying her myth. She understood the power she wielded, not just over the forest, but over perception itself. Her legend became permanent. Stories of the black slave girl who lived in the jungle and whom no white man could capture were told far and wide. She was spoken of as a ghost, a force of nature, a cunning strategist who had turned the world against those who sought to dominate her. Even those who had never seen her recognized the power of her presence. The jungle had become synonymous with her name, and her influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. In the final analysis, she had achieved something extraordinary. She had claimed her freedom not through rebellion or brute strength alone, but through mastery of the mind, the environment, and strategy. Her survival had depended on patience, intelligence, and observation, and she had honed these qualities to perfection. The forest was no longer merely a place to hide. It was a weapon, a fortress, and a partner in her quest for autonomy and safety. The girl's story, now legend, taught an enduring lesson. Power is not always measured by strength or numbers. Knowledge, observation, patience, and strategic thinking can elevate the powerless into forces that cannot be challenged. She had become untouchable, a living symbol of resilience and ingenuity, and her influence would resonate far beyond the jungle she called home. By the end of this 8th week, the girl's domination of her environment was complete. The men had learned through repeated failure that she could not be underestimated. The slaves had been inspired by her example, and the legend of the black slave girl who lived in the jungle was firmly cemented in the consciousness of everyone who knew her story. She was untouchable, invisible, and indomitable, the very embodiment of survival, intelligence, and the enduring human spirit in the face of oppression. Her journey was now a testament to the extraordinary capabilities of human intelligence, resilience, and strategy. She had not merely survived. She had thrived, turning fear, observation, and the jungle itself into tools of empowerment. Her legend, born from the intersection of intellect and nature, would endure as a story of courage, cunning, and the power of the mind to overcome even the most formidable challenges. And so, in the dense, whispering canopy of the jungle, she remained, a black slave girl who had lived, learned, and mastered her world, untouchable and eternal in her dominance. No white man would ever dare enter her domain again, and her story would echo through generations, a living reminder that intelligence, strategy, and courage could never be confined by chains, walls, or oppression.